with Pancho. Right on time. Thank you, Pancho. Take your time. Please. You're just going to watch from there? All right. Coming to you at your leisure from Hard Work Party Studios, this is Third Wave Arcade, making it, the show, how we did it. Hi, I'm Noah, and I cut my own hair. Third Wave Arcade is making an immersive game platform. When you think of making games, you might think of game engines like Unity or Unreal or Godot, but I think for certain type of games, my tool of choice, TouchDesigner, can be a great option. So, this episode, making games in TouchDesigner, ? So what is TouchDesigner? It's not the subject of this video, but it's a good question nonetheless. To be specific, TouchDesigner is a GUI to a framework with a runtime for making real-time stuff. TouchDesigner is node-based, that's a topic for another day, but it's an opinionated system that's graphics first. This is in contrast to another type of opinionated system like, let's say, Max MSP, which prioritizes the audio threads at the expense of video frame rate. In TouchDesigner's case, the primary event loop of a given application is by default going to be the process of creating a single frame. Now you can override that for certain purposes, but at its heart, TouchDesigner is really about getting a frame on screen. TouchDesigner, when it was first created as a fork of the non-real-time Houdini, which shares a lot of operators in common, was called a free-thinking environment. And that's a great name for the style of programming you can do in TouchDesigner. One of the big things about TouchDesigner is its interoperability with hardware, with communications protocols, with other softwares, and its capability of acting as the heart or the nexus to a really complex application that's coordinating on a command and control level, on a state level, on a graphics level, on a sensing level, on a sensor fusion level, all kinds of different inputs and outputs. I've been using TouchDesigner for a long time. I made a massively interactive Twitch show with the beloved Brooklyn Music Institution Elsewhere, including dozens and dozens of real-time audio reactive music videos, all running out of a single TouchDesigner process. I made an AI-powered mural that tells sustainability stories about transformation. I made a billboard disappear for Netflix. I made a large-scale 3D mapped, fully custom audio reactive LED installation that provides daylighting in a food hall and becomes a super dynamic nightclub at night. I made real-time data visualizations for the Indy 500. I contributed to the system that provides the backdrop for beloved music institution KEXP's live music studio. I've used it for a lot of beautiful stuff you wave your hands at, but the whole time it's felt to me that while occasionally there are elements of gamification in the things that I've made, I've never really used it to make games. And in fact, I don't see a lot of people using TouchDesigner to make games. This episode isn't meant to be TouchDesigner as a game engine. TouchDesigner is very much not a game engine. In fact, part of the inspiration for this episode, aside from my trying to use it to make games, was this post from quite a long time ago, about 10 years ago, from the great Vincent Ouzet, saying, "Hello, I was wondering how Touch would compare performance-wise to Unity for a 3D game. Do you think it's possible to handle something somewhat complex with multiple levels loading and unloading? Also, would Python be fast enough for game logic compared to their C# or JavaScript? I feel Touch is an awesome drafting tool, but wondering how well it scales up. I'm sure my question is far too vague to be answered properly, and obviously this is not Touch's strongest point. I was curious to read people's thoughts though. Here Vincent hits it all. And so, in the context of this video, we're not using this as an outline, but Vincent here is asking some great questions. He's asking about performance concerns. He's asking about handling large-scale abstractions, like level loading and unloading, also a performance concern. Should we take a poncho break? I think it's when I start talking, he takes off. He's asking about Python as an interpreted language performance-wise and its capabilities for handling game logic as compared to something compiled like C#. He says that he feels that TouchDesigner is an awesome drafting tool, something I was going to cover anyway, and he's wondering how well it scales up. Obviously, this is not Touch's strongest point, he says. I think I agree, but you got to use the right tool for the job, and there are certain type of games for which TouchDesigner is a great fit. That kind of gets right at the heart of what I want to cover. 10 years later, I'm going to try to answer it today. I know exactly what you meant, Vincent. So why would you use TouchDesigner then instead of Unreal or Unity or Godot, etc.? Let's go over the pros of working with TouchDesigner in general for a large scale or a complex application. First of all, as Vincent said, TouchDesigner is not just a great drafting tool. You can can do full-fledged applications and really complex things very quickly in TouchDesigner. I like to tell clients I could get you through 9 iterations of your idea in the time that it would take to do 1 in another tool. As it happens, getting that last 10% or maybe even skinning the thing, if those first 9 iterations were done in some kind of debug or simplified view, getting to that final level of polish in TouchDesigner can take another 90% of the time, as they say. At least for the right kind of thing, I feel that TouchDesigner is the bicycle for the mind that Steve Jobs referred to when he was talking about the personal computer. You can just move so quickly, you can put together so many complex things in such a short amount of time, change your mind, explore alternative ideas, etc., that it kind of feels like having a superpower when you're really solid at building complex things in TouchDesigner. Secondly, and in a related way, TouchDesigner has amazing flexibility. You can introspect really easily, reroute, make modular tooling, create HUDs, debug views, and insert those into the application while it is running, which gets to the third pro that I'd like to hit about TouchDesigner, is that it's kind of always on. TouchDesigner runs in its own runtime, it's built in its own language, it's easy to modify, and while TouchDesigner has what's called a perform mode where it prioritizes a certain window drawing to the screen and anything that window relies on in order to get its frames up, in general, there is kind of no distinction between how TouchDesigner runs when you are working on it and how TouchDesigner runs when you are presenting your application. Now, this is kind of a strength and a weakness. For certain things, like for Unreal's capability or Unity's capability to build EXEs and compile and optimize code along the way, that can be a real strength. But for TouchDesigner, it means that I can have my show literally running. I could be at a live event with images up on screen, with controlling LEDs, accepting sensing data, and I can literally be hacking on the application at the same time without interrupting what's going on the screens. That can make for a really unbelievable ability, like in the context of games, to have somebody playing the game while you hack on it. It also makes it really easy to make those developer tools or those production tools or those backstage HUDs, those debug views, and to do those while the software is running. It's almost like doing open heart surgery on a live patient or wrenching on a motor while it's running. Here's a view onto another HUD for a project that I'm working on. This display shows on the right-hand side the pre-visualization of these flip dot displays that are going to be clad in columns in the context of a new renovation project at the spacing that they're going to be at the appropriate scale, with the display going on them, driven by this pre-visualization or simulation of the spacing of the flip dot tiles, the negative space between them, their bitmap nature, the fact that they can only display one color on each side, and at the frame rate that they're capable of driving, which is about 20 FPS. And then here in the top left, we have a view into the actual simulation as it's running with some real-time data, some performance information. Again, don't crucify me, 20 FPS is the frame rate of the display itself. Control over the way the view of the simulation works, and then even like the ability to trigger waves in this context. You can even, through this view, fly over and get a look at the camera positioning, the view frustum of the camera, the positioning of the emitter, the positioning of the bounds of the simulation, and there's a whiz-bang view as well that kind of flies around and presents a good impression for the context in which your client's client needs to present something on, or you need to tell a story to, let's say, shareholders or investors or whatever. TouchDesigner is really good at allowing developers to keep their head on straight as they work through a project and to build tooling and developer side displays, GUIs and HUDs for all different kinds of stakeholders, including for themselves, not just as sanity checks, but to help tell the story or to flesh out something that is not actually going to be a part of the finished product. This is a good opportunity to show off my checkline strobe. Apropos of nothing, this is one of my favorite possessions. It's called a checkline strobe. This is a super high frequency strobe light that allows you to inspect machines that have super high speed periodic motion. This is what's required to see what's going on with a machine that's running at a really high speed. It allows you to set the strobe to the same frequency as, say, some assembly part that is repeatedly moving through a certain motion and kind of freeze its motion as it goes. And it's a good analogy for what's necessary to debug certain tools that have compiled runtimes or like semi-compiled runtime, like the play-in editor in Unreal. Unreal requires you to set breakpoints, to build separate debug things that are going to run somehow inside of the main application. And it can really fall down in contexts in which, let's say you're using a kind of exotic output context like end display or something like that, it becomes very, very hard to introspect the application as it's running and makes you jump through hoops in order to figure out what's going on. In TouchDesigner, that couldn't be easier. You can pixel peep on every single texture in any kind of chain that's manipulating texture-based data. You can make special table-based views. You can inspect the chop views on a sample basis and see exactly where things are going wrong, on top of building your own debug GUIs or heads-up views for getting a good handle on what's happening inside the guts of your application while it's running. Lastly, and this shouldn't be last really, the TouchDesigner community is unbelievable. I've had multiple experts falling all over themselves arguing about the best solution to a really complex problem that I have a lot of trouble explaining or giving people a test case to reproduce. In the TouchDesigner forum, in the Discord, I used to use the Facebook community, it's still there. You could ask a fairly open-ended question that requires a lot of research and isn't necessarily of interest to a lot of other people, and have not only the developers and the technical director of TouchDesigner chiming in, trying to figure out your problem for you, but you can have some of the best TouchDesigner developers in the world making test cases for you, showing you a few options of the best way to get it done, and diving deep with you on your options, on your alternatives, on why things work the way they do. I'm sure there are some really great Unreal communities out there, but multiple times I've had the experience where I've asked a question in the Unreal forum and gotten no answer at all. Same thing on the Discord, or searched for some problem that I'm having myself. Be very excited to see that there's a result in the forum. Someone has asked the exact same question, click through on it, and it's from 6 years ago, and nobody ever answered them. So community is a huge pro in the TouchDesigner column. So let's get to the cons, some of the weaknesses of using TouchDesigner to make games. One of them is the flip side of that flexibility of the blank slate that you get when you open TouchDesigner, and that's that very few batteries are included. This is less true every day as Derivative and the community make more and more pre-built stuff, but when people think of games, they often think of fairly large, sophisticated, asset-rich games. This isn't the type of tool that you want to use to make a multiplayer Souls-like or an MMO or a first-person shooter or something like that, which isn't to say that you couldn't do it in TouchDesigner, but it wouldn't be worth it. The reason game engines have the kind of inflexible, opinionated structure that they have is that they are providing you a leg up and a short route towards building games that use common abstractions, things like levels, things like characters. Those structures, as they exist in a game engine like Unreal, allow you to skip hand building a lot of really complex stuff that at first blush seems like it shouldn't be that big a deal, but as you get into a larger and larger game, becomes something that is really difficult to manage on your own. I wouldn't try to build a game like that in TouchDesigner for exactly that reason. But if you're talking about building simpler games that are about gameplay mechanics, that are more maybe arcadey or puzzle style in their nature, those kind of things aren't really a major issue. The other thing that goes in the con column of TouchDesigner is the flip side of that real-time lack of distinction between the finished version or the presentation version of the application and the version that you can wrench on and go directly under the hood. TouchDesigner is always on. It has no play in editor. It has no build. It has no concept of compiling. You can't wrap up an executable at all that is in any way different from the TouchDesigner runtime that you're using to make the application. In a certain sense, that's pretty great, because when you deploy a TouchDesigner installation, if there's a TouchDesigner license on the machine, you can always go under the hood and make changes to the thing in situ right where it is without having to replicate the build environment back in the lab and then bundle that thing up and bring it out and hope that it runs the same way on the production machine. The flip side of that coin means that TouchDesigner isn't particularly portable. Every machine that runs a TouchDesigner application has at least to have a Touch Player license on it, has to have Touch Player installed, separate from the TOE file or TOX file that you're running on that machine. And it means that TouchDesigner doesn't run on anything but Mac or Windows. No Linux, no consoles. It doesn't work on mobile. it doesn't work on the web. And right there, that distribution issue tells you a lot about why TouchDesigner is not commonly used to make the type of games that you're used to seeing come out of Unreal or Unity. It's really not made for it. That ability to bundle up an executable and send it away on its own as compiled code is kind of table stakes for a commercial game distribution. But again, for certain types of gaming, that's not an issue. So despite those two really serious drawbacks to making games in TouchDesigner, for casual gaming, Pancho, I'm gonna kill you. You kill this dog. For casual gaming and for arcade gaming, TouchDesigner can be a really great choice, which is convenient for me because that's what I'm up to. With Third Wave Arcade, we're trying to build an immersive arcade platform. Envision, instead of an arcade cabinet, instead a room that you walk into. The display fills your field of view. There are no controllers, no goggles. You use your body to play the game. Arcade-style gaming, intuitive, addictive, sticky gameplay in an amazing, awe-inspiring, multiplayer, vision-filling context. As you can imagine, building games for that type of platform requires getting your head around a whole bunch of different problems and inventing a whole bunch of new solutions. I have a weakness to admit. I'm not really very good at rotating 3D things inside my head. In fact, I remember taking an IQ test one time, the only time I did, maybe in 5th grade or something like that, and I did pretty good. Yeah, I did pretty good. But there's a section of the test where they show you a little mirror, maybe 2 mirrors side by side, and then you're given these pattern tiles and a reference, and you're asked to make the pattern that you see there. I couldn't do it. And I still have a lot of trouble envisioning how things are going to rotate in 3D space. The whole Z up, Z out thing, every time I have to make that context switch, it breaks my brain. So much so that I've been working on Third Wave Arcade projects with this little diorama, this little box that I found sitting right next to me so that I can hold the thing up and think about, okay, player goes here, I got some stuff happening just behind the wall, and because of the way the rendering works, anything that's here from the vantage point of the player is going to get flattened onto the floor, but anything that's back here will appear to be a little bit lower on the wall. What happens when something's in the corner, etc. If you need something like this, TouchDesigner can be a really great tool for you. Still, with all those strengths of TouchDesigner, there are some challenges to overcome. TouchDesigner has only one native state machine-like abstraction. It's a timer chop. It is really a timer that fires callbacks when it reaches different phases of its operation, which is a kind of a state machine, but is a kind of opinionated and inflexible one that isn't necessarily really well suited to living inside the larger abstraction of a game. I've been using a library called PyTransitions fairly frequently in my projects in order to bring in a state machine-like abstraction and then building my own state machine object, or comp in TouchDesigner parlance, to act as the decision maker and state tracker, command and control coordinator for deciding what's possible at each time, how things should change to get from state to state, and to manage things in a sensible way where the abstraction matches the logic of the game that you're building with it. I frequently work on projects where people do not make any kind of state machine abstraction and instead rely on scattered and spaghetti code to gate access to certain states from other states to make sure that things happen at certain times, but in a way where things are so thoroughly distributed across the application that it's really difficult to get your head around, almost impossible to debug, and extremely error prone. So if I'm giving any advice in this episode, I would definitely recommend that anybody building anything complex with TouchDesigner to build a formal state machine and to centralize all that logic in an extension. I've made other videos about that. I'll link to them in the show notes. A second thing that requires a lot of thought in TouchDesigner is deployment and operations stuff. TouchDesigner, as mentioned before, runs in its own runtime and provides some basic tools for building things that have a concept of a perform mode or have to live in a certain state that's a presentation to the audience or to the user while the thing is running. But Derivative, the company that make TouchDesigner, have made some additions recently that make it possible to run TouchDesigner in other contexts. The tool is called Touch Engine, and it allows you to run Tox files in other applications. Currently, Unreal Engine Engine is officially supported by derivatives. So there is a context in which you can run TouchDesigner as an executable inside Unreal Engine. There's an independent project called TouchPy by Keith and Ids. I'm not going to try your last names, guys. That runs Touch Engine inside a pure Python application, and more are on the way. Additionally, there are other applications that will launch TouchDesigner itself as an executable, but manage its context on the way to screen. The major one that comes to mind is Pixera, which is a new media server and show control application that can launch TouchDesigner instances alongside Unreal instances, alongside playback and 3D media from its own timeline, all without breaking the signal to the screen. Lastly, one thing to check out is PseudoSignal's PseudoMagic project. This is a application that allows you to remotely monitor and command and control TouchDesigner applications as they're running out in the field. Now, a lot of developers will roll their own solutions for these sorts of things, but it bears mentioning that when you're trying to deploy TouchDesigner in a context like we are in an arcade, there's some additional tooling that's going to be required in order to make TouchDesigner something that can truly stand on its own, but still be operated remotely, give you the telemetry that you need, allow you to introspect what's happening, and potentially provide remote support without taking the thing down to the front of the screen. When I thought about doing this episode, I immediately thought about Simon Alexander Adams, aka Polyhop. If you're on the grams and you're curious about TouchDesigner, you've probably come across Simon's Dailies project. He's currently on his 2300th, how would you say that, 2300th daily TouchDesigner sketch. An amazing feat in and of itself, and watching his progression from the beginning of this project has also been really inspiring. He brings a certain aesthetic of his own to just about every technique and new idea that the community comes up with. And along the way, Simon has made some really cool game sketches. Among the more complex personal projects he's shown off have been some game prototypes that have exactly the sort of arcadey mechanics, the super squishy feel, the sparkly look, and that kind of dopamine-inducing je ne sais quoi that you want in a game. And he's doing them all in TouchDesigner. He was really generous to give me some of his time and take me through that stuff. And along the way in our conversation, he mentioned just about everything I wanted to mention in this episode. So if it feels redundant, it's because great minds think alike. And by that, I mean I'm super smart. And so is Simon. So first question I got for you is like, are you familiar at all with Unreal, Unity, etc.? Do you use them in your work?
I mean, I used them a while ago, like in school, and I dabbled with them. And I think that was when I was still figuring out what tools I really liked using. I think ultimately I ended up in TouchDesigner. But I think back in the day, I did build like some procedural levels in both of them just as like exercises. I didn't have the same programming chops or like mental hadn't wrapped my head around a lot of like the logic systems that I have now that are useful in both kind of like interactive experiences and games. There's a lot of like overlap, I think, in terms of the kinds of logic and state machines, really. Like those exist in both. And so when I came back, I'm like, oh, let me make some sketches in TouchDesigner that are games. A lot of that flowed easier than when, say, I was doing it and still very new to all of these tools. But it has been a second since I've used like Unreal and Unity. I always look at them and say, you got to get into those more.
So you're using TouchDesigner because it's the hammer that you have, not because you're like preferring it over another. When I'm talking about making games, obviously you're using TouchDesigner to make art installations, just interactive installations, nonstop, probably faster than you can handle. And then it's just kind of an organic thing for you to go, no, I'm going to make something that's a game or game-like. I'm going to use the tool that I always use.
And there is overlap. I think sometimes I'm making interactives or installations that have like game elements. If I want to use like a sensor, I mean, now I think you can get those probably into Unreal or Unity in different ways, but equally like TouchDesigner, it's like, I want to use an Azure Connect and make a game. I'm already used to using that too. So sometimes it'll be some sort of a hybrid, but I have done some just like making games that have like Xbox controller inputs that would work really well in Unity or Unreal. I think it's both the hammer that like I am quickest with, right? But in some ways too, I think that it's perhaps a better tool for like rapid prototyping, which is sort of what I did. I do like daily sketching in TouchDesigner as well. For one, I was on vacation at my dad's house in Western Mass and hanging out with my brother, who's like, at the time, I think he was like 10. I was like, I should just like try to make a game for fun. And so maybe over the course of like 4 days, I would spend like an hour or two each day. And I came up with something that felt pretty it felt good. It wasn't obviously complete, but it was a little mini mini game thing with sound and like Xbox input and like different power-ups and things and procedural level generation. And it was interesting like hanging out with my brother, and he'd be like, can you add like mines? And I'm like, okay, like this kind of funny thing where he's like playing it while I'm actually coding it, because TouchDesigner is real time rendering it while with the network open and not in perform mode. I'm sitting there with him. Sometimes I'd break something and he'd be like, what did you do? And I'm like, well, I'm trying to add that feature that you asked for. Give me 1 second.
You're like going down my list of things that I was going to talk about in the context surrounding our discussion. You've done such a good job of adding those kind of dopamine hits. Everything feels juicy and sparkly in a way that like is extremely arcadey, and it makes you want to keep playing.
Yeah, this was the one I was talking about that I prototyped when I was on vacation. It's, I think, working title was like Molecule Maze, I think. Let me reset it. There we go. So you can collect yellow dots. Each level that you succeed at, you kind of like add a notch to your character. This, for instance, is like a power up. A bunch of stuff here that just needs more context, if you were actually like...
It's a sketch.
Throw someone at it. Yeah, it was definitely a sketch. Yeah. So there's a couple more power ups. There's like a map I could find. So yeah, I can try to find the other power ups. I could also just give myself those. I don't have to find them. Has map. There we go. I still have okay, there we go. I give myself all the power-ups.
Cheat.
Oh, it gives me those red lines. So that's like a off-screen. I can kind of tell if there's mines in the proximity. So yeah, it was, as I went, it was like just to like, oh, let me add another power-up. Let me do this. And trying to keep it in a way that definitely needs some refactoring, right? Like I think I would clean this up a lot, this network here. There's things that would want to be organized slightly differently, but that's what happens when you sketch. Some of my favorite things are just like using like the distance map, like the jump flooding algorithm for the like bounciness, which is just actually feels really good. Like I actually I'm like, I want to make a game for real that does this, because it has this physics quality. You bounce around the maze, but it's also like a really dumb detection system. I have the level here and it samples above and below and left and right and then just pushes you away from like a gradient, just pushes you downhill.
Games is all just a whole bunch of really dirty tricks. Yeah.
Graphics and games.
On the like dev level, do you have any reusable like composable tools that you use when you're doing game stuff in TD or in general that you brought over from doing other TD stuff?
So I have like a lot of different components that I use. I mean, things like jump flooding, which I know this is David Braun's talks, but there's like a lot of tools that I gather that are handy. Like this is something that I plan to level up, but I end up doing a lot more like build from scratch and then pulling in things. Yeah. Which keeps me sharp. Like I can go fast, right? For this one, for instance, I have some components that are automatically set up to work with TD Ableton. It just has some scripts in it that sends MIDI to a chord. I can just drop my target here and feed it channels. And I usually have to rewrite the internals every time, which is what I need to like build the tool better, because I'm always like, oh, I actually want the velocity to function in this way, or I want to randomize the pitch. That's one actually on my list, is I'm like, I can really consolidate that into a good tool now that I've done it 10 times. A lot of with the gaming, I haven't done it so much that each time I do it, I've sort of approached it in a very like, okay, I'm going to try to do this in a better way than I did last time.
To me, like the core tension is is this thing so simple that I could just redo it from scratch? It's, did I make any mistakes or squash any bugs in the process of making this the last time that I might run into again? Because I have the memory of a goldfish. I'll step on that same fucking rake again that I stepped on the last 2 times I made this tool and like still not learn my lesson. So for me, one of the big advantages of reusing something is just not stepping on the same rake again. If you went back to before you've made any games in TD, what advice would you give yourself? What rake would you avoid stepping on?
And I don't know if I've stepped on this as much with games as just kind of like generally building like state machines.
You're going all the way down my list, dude. You're hitting all my stuff.
But I think in that sense, there's like a flow of logic, to conceive of, and keeping that like as simple as possible and really kind of trying to, one, also like store that in one spot as much as possible. You are defining like the numbers and then you're defining like the look, right? And those things actually you could pull apart. Under the hood of any game, I think about this all the time. There's like systems that are happening and then, you draw something that represents that lets us actually kind of like tell a story about it.
You actually just showed it in your example. You were showing the black map and then you're generating the jump flood like force field off of that, but then you're skinning it. You can play the game in debug view essentially.
Right, exactly.
And all the logic runs on that. And then there's a presentation layer on the front end, which you can turn up or down for the hardware, or like skin differently for different projects, or turn off if you're trying to figure out why it's not working because it's not actually involved in the way the game plays.
Yeah, as much as possible, I try to keep, that game state in one spot. Like with this game, for instance, I think like there's certain bits of logic that I do keep next to, say, like the different tools, for instance, like the power-ups. They have a little bit of like timer logic and stuff. You activate it. It's almost more of like an object-oriented approach in that sense, like where you're like,
or an entity component system.
Yeah. So in that instance, it reaches back to the game state when it's done to say, okay, like, or if you try to activate it while it's activated still, or in a cooldown state, it just doesn't do anything, right?
That makes sense.
It's like sometimes there's modules that have internal logic, and you have a game state that might represent, your level design, and you might have another base that represents your player, but it really is game to game. But I think trying to, like, from the beginning or as early as possible as you go, just making sure you're not just working in one base, if we're thinking about TouchDesigner, like really kind of making modules that represent the different components, even having one just for rendering if it's that kind of game. Like sometimes it's not. If it's one where you're rendering everything, do it in one spot. For both interactive installations or anything you're doing in Touch, like the more you can start doing that, it'll be nicer to your computer as you're playing with it too. Not rendering a huge network. I mean, it's less related to games specifically. I feel like there are things that I feel like I do over and over again in Touch that I actually think will be resolved a little bit with Pops, which is exciting because I think that's like the upcoming, TouchDesigner alpha stuff. But I feel like I do a lot of like really like specific vertex shader work. I'm just like, I need to deform these things so that they have this kind of motion, right? Like, adding noise displacement, for instance, inside of a vertex shader to instances and those kinds of things that I'm like, I can just do that in Pops now, which is, once that's out, I'll be super pumped for that. So there's those kind of little graphics things. That's maybe not a great example. I'm trying to think of a good like broad thing. One thing that I think is not necessarily a rake, but just that I need, like, I've started trying to incorporate and I'm like way late to the game, is just like using extensions. I've started doing it. I'm like, oh, actually this is just a better way to do what I've been doing. I've just been like lazy about it as someone who works alone mostly. So like, for instance, this game, I'm not using extensions, but I should, because there's like a couple spots where when this thing is done, it calls a function, that has to, it has a couple of those where I'm like, that actually would make a lot of sense to refactor it. But again, I was just like doing it on vacation. So it's so fast to prototype and to figure out how it feels. The number of games that I play even that don't feel as good as they could, I'm just like, wow. And I think it's hard, like objectively hard to make a game that just nails the feel, like the art clicks with it, especially like the more people who are involved, the bigger it gets. Of course, it's like kind of both surprising and not that some of the best feeling games are like small endeavors, because there's not a lot to get in the way of, say, quickly getting to that vision. I mean, can still take a long time, but there's not like a diluting of it. It's kind of one of those things where you like know it when you feel it.
Brother, thank you for your time.
All right, yeah. Thanks for having me.
What TouchDesigner games did I miss? Games. Games have objectives. Games you can lose. Games can be competitive, but don't have to be. But there are stakes in games. I'm not talking about things where you get a score for no reason and it's not attached to any objective and you can't lose. I'm talking about real games. Who's making games? Get at me in the comments, please. Have a civil but spirited discussion. And importantly, please let me know who I should talk to about games in TouchDesigner, because we're going to come back to this. Did you enjoy this? I hope so, because it was hard on me to make it. I'm literally sweating. If you want to watch me sweat, literally and figuratively, as I try to manifest a new kind of gaming through sheer force of will, please like, subscribe, tell a friend, and leave a comment below, a provocative comment. Don't be an edgelord, all right? Don't start any fights, but like something that's going to get other people to comment so that there's a lot of comments, and then YouTube will think this is an interesting show. Next episode, God willing, we're going to be going through my research on Markerless, Realtime, Multicamera, multiplayer, infrared, motion capture. I've been doing a ton of research on this. I can't wait to show you what I found out. Thanks for watching.